but of American culture. The impending tragedy was that this was not foreseen by these men or their leaders. American forces were not simply in Vietnam to fight and destroy the communists. Consistent with fighting for a way of life, they aimed to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. In the rural areas of Vietnam, which had suffered from the neglect of the colonial administration and the callous disinterest of urban-centered South Vietnamese regimes, the U.S. aimed at improving the quality of life for the ordinary Vietnamese through projects aimed at developing infrastructure and welfare. American doctors would bring improved health care to remote villages. Those villagers would be the targets of the Vietcong, who aimed to supplant and replace the South Vietnamese government, organizing the peasants into a communist society. The problem, as ever, was that when at the end of the day the Americans left, the Vietcong would emerge from hiding and reassert communist authority. The Vietnam War had many battlegrounds. It was an urban war, fought in the city streets of the South. A war in which the Viet Cong used the weapons of the terrorist. The images of helicopters circling over a claustrophobic jungle in which infantry struggles with unseen Viet Cong is but part of the Vietnam story. Indiscriminate terrorist bombing of areas frequented by Americans and the cold-blooded assassination of South Vietnamese government officials were ruthlessly employed. For the Americans, it created a war with no clearly defined front line. Who was friend? Who was the enemy? The war was a rural war. The classic infantry action was the search and destroy mission, a patrol through the countryside to seek out, challenge, and engage the Viet Cong. In this landscape, communist forces sought to avoid battle on American terms. Only fighting in the way the communists wanted. Sniper attack, sudden ambush, booby trap, and landmine were constant threats. The set-piece conventional battle, where the other side wore a uniform, was rare. A demonstration of the massive material advantages of the American forces were fire support bases. The heavily fortified compounds acted as bases for artillery that could be called to support an infantry unit on search and destroy. The fire support base was also used as bait to provoke the Viet Cong to attack, draw the communists into a battle where the guerrillas could be annihilated. The fire support base could be established in any terrain. The enormous material advantage of the U.S. forces meant that this heavy artillery support could be brought into the most remote and inaccessible area with ease. No foot soldier on patrol was isolated or alone and could call in massive help. Viet Cong tactics were not to fight the war by the American rules and make this striking power irrelevant. The Viet Cong aimed for control of the countryside through intimidation and indoctrination by kidnapping and murder of anyone linked to the South Vietnamese government. Rather than face heavy attack, the Viet Cong would always retreat before a great weight of fire could be summoned. U.S. soldiers would be attacked in a brief flurry of automatic fire. A mine might explode on a remote path. A lone sniper might fire a single shot. Too often, the sighting of the enemy was just a fleeting glimpse of a distant figure, the weight of heavy shells to fall upon shadows and footprints, places where the enemy had been. If a weapon of war can stand as an icon for Vietnam, it is the helicopter taking off or landing amidst a swirl of dust and noise. It was in Vietnam that the helicopter realized its full potential as a weapon of war. The helicopter enabled U.S. and South Vietnamese forces to quickly concentrate, enveloping and surrounding the Viet Cong. Supplies were easily delivered, reinforcing American material advantages. This power to project overwhelming force meant that when the Vietcong were brought to battle, the result was a heavy communist defeat with huge loss of life compared to American forces. The helicopter came in many variants, as troop transport large and small, as gunship, and a mover of the largest equipment. The definitive Vietnam helicopter was the UH-1, the Huey. The distinctive whine of its turbine and the beat of its rotor, the iconic sounds of Vietnam. Helicopters were mass-produced and employed in huge numbers. The successful armies of history never neglect and casually dispose of their traditions, instead adapting the best of their history to new weapons and techniques. New types of fighting unit were created by the helicopter. The American Air Cavalry blended the mobility and striking power of the helicopter with the aggressive tradition of cavalry as elite soldiers. The assault from helicopter with rocket and machine gun brought a new dimension of striking power to ground conflict. The qualities that made the helicopter such a devastating weapon in the military war were its weaknesses in the political war. The helicopter enabled U.S. forces to operate from safe, secure bases, far from the villages and fields where the struggle for the loyalty of the population was fought. U.S. troops could go home in the evening. When the Americans flew away, villagers knew that perhaps in just hours the Vietcong would return and once more take charge.